Welcome to our study. I'm always tempted to say good morning or good evening, but of course, many of you are in different places. It might be morning where we are having evening. Anyway, can somebody just confirm that the sound is okay? For some reason, my device is not letting me know. Sound is good. Excellent. Thank you. All right. Okay. So we will today be looking at some very interesting discussions that pertain to the way that we understand reality and approach the whole idea of wisdom, what we refer to as ultimate truth. And last time somebody was commenting that that there's so gonna dub on me that I've been ragging on on Tsongkhapa. And of course it's true. There is some themes which are treated in different ways in the different traditions. But there's not a single Tibetan master who would not say that you could attain enlightenment on the basis of all the various traditions. And in fact, it's more about the emphasis when we're presenting particular topics. We'll be seeing that here, but I want to make it quite clear that that there's a robust atmosphere in Tibetan Buddhism where it's quite common to sort of say, hey, you know, in terms of your presentation there's some, you know, we can debate that. And so it's not like everybody just sort of goes over in their corner and says, well, I have a different opinion, goodbye. It's very much so. Say you say that, well, that has this unwanted consequence. You know, this entails nihilism. This entails eternalism. So there's that kind of, you could say, there's an accommodation for that sort of approach. It's legit. It's not viewed as being, you know, I mean, from the outside, maybe it'll be perceived in various ways, but it's essentially part of the dialectics that you had in India, certainly, and also with which the Tibetans, you could say, were custodians of. But it also has that added benefit that while we could say, well, you know, now you're meditating, settle into the inconceivable, you know, and that's all very well. But if you see it as juxtaposed to, you could approach this analytically as a bridge way to engage the, you could say, settling into the non-conceptual, then already there's beginning to be an understanding that becomes clearer. There's more certainty. Otherwise, we could very well be practicing, you know, meditation on emptiness, completion stage, all these various practices without really having a clear idea exactly what are we doing in terms of our relationship to our perceptions, our relationship to our you could say project of eliminating confusion and uncovering a disposition of greater perspective. So that's where there's a lot of value in that there being these debates and there being a fair deal of precision about it. Of course, what's also implicit is, yes, the precision and so forth, the whole debate, this all plays out within the context of study. You could say the actual engagement within meditation, that's something else, and that necessarily, and this is of course particularly in the Kagyu and Nyingma tradition, this is necessarily non-conceptual, not about analysis. But then again, there are those who would say, well, if you do that, then there's a danger of just sitting there and not really knowing what you're doing, and so it's important to have an approach that at all times engages analysis. So there's a little bit of back and forth. And of course, there we might sort of decide, well, this is quite helpful for me, or the teacher also, you know, would say this will be more helpful for you, that might be more helpful for you. So there's these differences in approach and in methodologies. So this will be treated a little bit here this time. Oh, yeah. So as always, kindly generate the motivation of bodhicitta, and then invoking the wisdom of Jamgön Mipham through the blessing of awareness, emptiness, Manjushri Kumara. You open the expanse of wisdom and its 8 minds of confidence, thus mastering the vast treasuries of transmission and realization. Mipham, Manjushri Gosha, I supplicate you. So we're still within the overview of Mipham's Buddhist works. Chapter 6, Emptiness and the Non-Conceptual. So, Dr. Duckworth, he says, emptiness is a central topic in Mipham's works. His writings at once clarify emptiness and at the same time retain its non-conceptual, indeterminate meaning as eluding the mind. So on one hand, we are working with the mind in terms of understanding and clarifying emptiness, and at the same time, we're also understanding that wisdom lies beyond the mind. And of course, this we often see. This point is often made. So we have a section here that's called Analysis and Experiential Insight. And there we speak about 2 approaches to negation. There's analytical negation of inherent existence, which you could say is where we look at the mistaken perceptions in terms of the objective. So that's where we undertake these analyses which we find, for example, in the Vibhashika, where we look at phenomena and see that they're made up of finer, more subtle particles, and these subtler particles are made up of ultimately indestructible, indivisible particles. So that's where that exercise is done. And then, of course, then within the Mahayana, we would see, well, even the so-called indivisible particles necessarily do have divisions. And ultimately, these labels that we give to any object, they are all empty labels. We cannot find any, you could say, ultimate basis for the way that we impute label and identity on phenomena. But all of that constitutes analytical negation. It's entirely logical. And also within, you could say, physics nowadays, we seem to be arriving at similar ideas. And such an understanding, that kind of analysis, it gives us a place where we can, you could say, there's a solid ground of clear, rational understanding. This we can explain to our atheist, you could say, religion-hating, anti-whatever friends, and they would necessarily have to concede that there just might be some reason, some logic to this. So as such, we stand on a solid ground of what is indisputable, logical, real. In terms of just, you could say, the validity of our observation. Now that's the analytical. Then there's the experiential insight. That's different. That's where we begin to look at, well, we look at those, look at the particles, we see how they are composed of possibly indivisible particles, how again these can be analyzed and seen to also be, in fact, constructed conceptually. And that's where we begin to say, who's doing this? Who's doing this? Who's projecting? Who's doing the labeling? Where does that take place? Well, that takes place within the dimension of the subjective. That's not where there we're going beyond the dimension of the objective. We're going into the subject, the confused subject. And that's where we identify that the way that we label, the way that we perceive things has very little to do with the way that things actually are. And so that's where we begin to see there's a delusional projection. I project all sorts of labels onto things, and even though my friends around me, they share this perception, in fact, it has very little to do with the actual object itself. And that's where there's a construction of objects in a particular way that, in fact, does not really apply when we analyze things. So we ask ourselves, where does this come from? And then where we also begin to say, well, can I actually find a subject? I'm having a hard time finding an object. Can I also find a subject? And that's where we begin to see there's a distorted relationship to reality that originates within the subjective. And that's where the analytical negation is quite helpful, but it necessarily needs to go back to the responsible quarters, the person to be held responsible for this distortion, this delusion. And that's where we come back to the subjective. And that's why once we have some understanding of that, the subjective is getting all, gone delusional. That's where something needs to be done that lies beyond just the, you could say, intellectual exercise of just coming down with some intellectual assertions. That's where we need to begin to work with our entire condition of the subjective. And that's what's the practice of meditation, where we then discontinue the ordinary confusion. And that's what meditation is all about. On the basis of the view that's established, we then engage and integrate this understanding beyond just intellect through the practice of meditation. And that's where it's no longer just analysis, it's an insight that is experiential. Now, I'll save you from my clearing my throat. Now, the yogic practice school, and the yogic practice school, Chittamatra, and also the Yogacharya in general, they're the ones that are very, very interested in the experiential dimension. And they would then say, well, when you do this kind of sort of looking at the object and you identify the emptiness of all phenomena, then you're going a little bit too, you're leaving essentially, nothing there. So that's where they would say that there's still a non-dual, this thing we looked at last time, this sort of the non-dual cognitive in Tibetan, which means the reflexive awareness, the reflexive awareness, the knowing that we know. They would then say, that you can't get away, you could say, you can't analyze that away. Anyway, that's then where the middle way says, well, even that, I'm afraid, or we're afraid, that also cannot exist inherently. So Duckworth says, for the yogic practice school, negating inherent existence can be seen as going too far, particularly if the facticity of authentic experience is negated by a reductive objectifying analysis. However, for a middle way approach, negating duality has not necessarily gone far enough. In the middle way, one must negate inherent existence globally, so that even an appeal to a non-dual experience is subject to its uncompromising critique. The dialectical interplay between these two modes of inquiry steers the middle path for Mipham. Okay, so we have these two views, and Mipham Rinpoche is very interested in that. And this is what's reflected in the discussions that are following between the analytical approach and the experiential. Both very important, but as we'll see here, Mipham Rinpoche also identifies some places where you say, in his view, unnecessarily, there are some unwanted consequences in some of the positions that some of the existing schools have sort of subscribed to. So, there's definitely an agreement that mistaken beliefs about objective phenomena must go. So that's the objective dimension, which we arrive at through analysis. Mistaken beliefs about that has to go. And when we say objective phenomena, of course, it also means the subject itself that is doing the analysis. So that's where the implication when we do the analysis is, or rather assess the nature of, you could say, phenomena universally, both the what we call self of phenomena and also the self of person. The the beliefs about these phenomena have to go. And this is where the yogic practice school, they agree, except they would say there's a non-dual reflexive awareness that is that you could say has a reality. So in that sense, there is these two positions. But the point about it, and Mipham particularly then, is quite clear that these mistaken beliefs about solidifying the objective phenomena needs to be, it has to go, and also the notion that even reflexive awareness has a reality has to go. And we saw that last time in the, you could say, the discussions between the middle way and the yogic practice schools. There's a difference between the Nyingma and the Gelug, however, in this regard. The Gelug, they emphasize conceptual analytical meditation that negates inherent existence. Sorry again. So that's where there is a there's the notion that whether you're settling into an analytical position of negating phenomena, inherent existence, through analytical meditation, or if you're just settling into simply just settling meditation, that's absolutely fine. That's absolutely the same. It's fine to do either. In fact, the Gelug would probably say that if you settle into the sort of just settling the mind, there's a big danger that it's lacking prajna. And in fact, the Nyingmas, they would also agree. Yes, just settling the mind sort of peacefully doesn't necessarily entail wisdom. But at the same time, there's a lot of trust that there could be that quality of being not deluded within settling into the non-conceptual. So there's a big emphasis there's a big difference in emphasis between the two approaches. So then the Nyingma emphasized settling meditation that dissolves this dualistic fixation. So that's where the Nyingma approach is then the meditation that is not perpetuating this ongoing confused dynamic of subject and object, this and that. And that's achieved through settling meditation. The analytical meditation is known as Qigong, and that's quite well known. If you ever come across meditation instruction in the Gelug tradition, there's a lot of emphasis on this analytical component, even at the level of it being taught in a popular way. And in the Nyingma tradition, there's very often emphasis, for example, the way that in Siddhartha's intent that we practice meditation. We essentially, in the retreats and so forth, we essentially practice settling meditation. Of course, we do that in conjunction with, you could say, a clarifying what it is that we're doing and clarifying to the extent that there is a component of prajna that doesn't get, there's not a going into some sort of vacuous space in the way that we practice settling meditation. But there's certainly a difference in emphasis between the two traditions. And of course, this is particularly reflected in then once we speak about the particular meditation practices in the Vajrayana when it comes to Mahamudra and Dzogchen. So Douglas Duckworth says, while meditation on a semblance of the genuine meaning of emptiness, meaning the analytical conceptual understanding of that, can form a bridge between the conceptual and the non-conceptual for Mipham and Tsongkhapa. For Mipham, the cause, concept of unity must resemble the effect, genuine unity, and not simply be the conceptual apprehension of a mere absence. And this is where we look at how in the Gelug tradition, to understand the ultimate is very much established on the basis of just having this analytical insight that phenomena don't possess inherent existence. But for Mipham Rinpoche, it's more than that. It's not just that there's lack of inherent existence, but there is actually a luminous quality of wisdom, which, while it can't be grasped, while it doesn't necessarily possess inherent existence, it's much more than just this, what we will see, a non-affirmative negation, simply saying there's nothing. It is a quality in which there is also wisdom. There is that, what we looked at last time also, the uncategorized, the non-categorized absolute. So that's where the initial semblance, meaning having some idea of where we're heading with meditation from the start, needs to actually constitute a proper cause. There has to be a proper understanding in order for the effect, an actual realization of this unity to take place. So and also it says analytical meditation involves object-oriented reasoning and analysis. In contrast, resting meditation is a contemplative practice that carries out focused attention, that carries out focused attention on an object or sustained awareness without an object. So one is about analysis, looking at the object. The other is about resting. There could be something that enables us to rest, like we have in shamatha. There's something that brings us back, or there is settling without an object. So initially, and again, here we're just talking about common for everybody. Initially, there needs to be an analytical process to develop certainty about emptiness. So this is that's what we do when we approach the entire project of eliminating the cause of suffering in the Buddhist teaching, where we're looking at where is it we went wrong, where is it delusion originates, and understanding that we're grasping at something that actually doesn't have any reality, and we're introducing much vaster understanding of reality through understanding dependent arising, emptiness, and so forth. Basically enabling the mind to find its way out of its dualistic, distorted mode and into a greater understanding of wisdom. And this is facilitated through this analytical process that identifies how nothing can be grasped and as such can be understood in terms of emptiness. Here, the conceptual negation counters the false apprehension of objects. So that's where just using concepts enables us to say, hey, that would seem so real is actually not real if I really look. And this helps us to understand that snake is actually not a snake. That solidity is not so solid. And as such also the self that is so uptight and sort of centered on itself, it actually doesn't really have any reality. And conceptual negation of that enables us to begin to let go of our taking subject and object so seriously. But in doing so, there's a clear division between the two truths. There's obviously a big difference between how a confused subjectivity experiences reality and how an unconfused subjectivity experiences reality. So there is the relative truth and absolute truth or ultimate truth. Now, once there is this, you could say, understanding that we gain through study and reflecting, Then there has to be an application. There has to be an integration of this insight. And that's not about the words and having, all the right answers. This has to be integrated through a very intimate process of looking and humbly recognizing how we ourselves are subject to this false apprehension of objects, and what can we do about it? And then once we understand, then to discontinue the ordinary confusion. And the ordinary confusion, we discontinue it through meditation. It's just like in everyday life when we get all wound up. We know that what we need to do is take a deep breath. We need to chill. We need to unwind. And we will be in a much better condition to actually interact and understand and relate to reality, to what's going on. So the sanity is there. And so this is, of course, taken to a much greater degree with a complete understanding of reality, but that's where there has to be an actual process of working with oneself. And that's where we work with oneself and also work beyond concepts. So that's where the conceptual gives way to direct experience. And that's also where the division between the two truths, that there's the sort of confused way in which we are stuck, and then there's the unconfused condition, that actually begins to dissolve. There's more and more, essentially, well, what we in doctrinal terms could say, there's less and less divorce between appearance and emptiness. We more and more engage wisdom within our perceptions. And that's, of course, also what we looked at last time in terms of the authentic and inauthentic. That's where in graduating towards the authentic insight, there's a graduating into the ultimate truth, as you could say, the ultimate truth in terms of experience. So this again, of course, harks back to these two ways of understanding the two truths we looked at last time. But anyway, the first part is about analysis. The second part is about experience. So Douglas Duckworth says these two ways of being, seeing what is non-dual and seeing what is not inherent existence. The first being about the experience, non-dual, and the second being about the analytical. These two ways of being reflect two approaches to the ultimate truth in the authentic, inauthentic, and appearance, emptiness models of the two truths. So like we looked at last time, one has to do with the authentic experience versus inauthentic experience, and that has to do with the discovery and settling into and integrating the experience of wisdom as per the third turning of the wheel, Buddha nature, and emptiness appearance model. And that has to do with the second turning of the wheel, which is basically establishing an ontological vision of how appearance and emptiness are indivisible. So these two models, represented in the yogic practice school and the middle way, respectively, are revealed in the contemplative practices inspired by these two traditions. So that's where we have various ways of engaging the meditation practice, where we, yeah. I'm a little bit wary of saying something particular about this. We would generally say the Madhyamika is, you could say, on one level, it's analytical meditation, but it's also has components of course, non-analytical. And that's where the Madhyamika, in some way, points to, for example, the higher Vajrayana in terms of for example, the great perfection. And also then the yogi practice school, we could say, has to do with the ways of engaging the vision of pure perception. But then again, both of these actually, they work together. So in this way, and this is also what's, of course, Mipham, which is, you you say view is that these two approaches, they work perfectly together. They're also in terms of the way that they're integrated. In post-meditation, that's when we're not meditating, that's when we're analyzing. That's when, we can say post-meditation, we can also say pre-meditation. It's simply when we're not settling into, you can say, the space of non-thought. And that's what we say in post-meditation, there is analysis and a conceptual division of the two truths. So from the point of view of us understanding what we're doing, then we can say, yes, we can analyze, we can see there's a place where we're caught by duality, there's a place where we settle free from duality. And that's where whether we're talking about relative and ultimate truth, whether we're talking about meditation, post-meditation, and so on, there is this concept. Whereas in meditation, there's no analysis, there's no division of the two truths. It's settling into equipoise, which is very nice. What's not to like about that? And this is also the good news. We're not doing philosophy here. We're doing experience. But it's very helpful for us to know that the experience is not confused experience. So, Dr. Duckworth says, yet conceptual analysis need not necessarily conflict with experiential insight, because conceptual analysis in pre-meditation can induce meditative experience by breaking down conceptual frameworks. Moreover, conceptual analysis in post-meditation can play an important role too. By representing meditative experience in a systematic, conceptually framed structure, it permits a distinction to be made between authentic experience and inauthentic modes of beings. That's, on one hand, very philosophical in terms of just assessing emptiness, but it's also very, very real in terms of practice. It's also where we can identify when we're deluded individuals and when we're held by, you could say, impure motivation, held by neurosis, clashes, and so on, and when we're not. So there, with an introspective, with the introspective optics, looking at how our mind is, we can see how what is you can say authentic, what is inauthentic, what is confused and not confused. Is wisdom and reflexive awareness synonymous? For the yogic practice school, it is, yes. And towards the end of this chapter, and by the way, I should say, I didn't actually complete my homework. So there's a little bit at the end where there's a little bit of a, you could say, the incomplete, unfinished chapter is unfinished, but actually that's where there's a strong point being made actually about how Mipham Rinpoche identifies wisdom as there's different ways of going about. There's a discussion around this, but anyway, we could say that for the yogic practice school, wisdom is reflexive awareness. In the middle way, they would actually, in practice, okay, they would settle into reflexive awareness as wisdom, but they would also have the view that it doesn't have inherent existence, and that's where the Madhyamaka and the yogic practice school, they differ somewhat. Anyway, this is a very, very good question. Anyway, it's something that will be addressed here. So Douglas Duckworth says, in any case, an essential point here is that to fully understand emptiness or the nature of reality, analysis is not enough for Mipham. To overcome our deeply ingrained habits of conceptual fixation, we must drop conceptual fixation altogether. And that's, of course, where we look into that, again, points to the dimension of practice. That's where we need to necessarily begin to, this is where we rely on meditation instruction. So just say, I'm not going to think. You know, that's a bit like, well, what is it again? To tell the mind to not think, it's like telling our teenage daughter she can't leave her room or something like that. This is very sweet. This is a man. I think he has 2 kids. Anyway, he it's very refreshing when this you think about Douglas Duckworth is, yes, we could say he's an academic, but he's also a practitioner. He would not be able to write like he does and actually you could say present this material in such an intuitive and profound way if it wasn't that he wasn't also a practitioner. But it's very refreshing when this sort of the academic flavor is interrupted by, you could say, the scenario drawn from real life. I remember Tango Rinpoche, he would also say when it comes to meditation, leave the mind naturally, because he says it's a bit, or to sort of trying to stop thoughts. He said it's a bit like if you have a cat and you leave a cat in a room with closed doors and windows, and you'll come back home and the cat will have destroyed your sofa and chairs. Whereas if you leave the windows and the doors open, then the cat will just lie and sleep peacefully. So anyway, so that's where it's not, we need to necessarily engage practice, and like he says, that's easier said than done, but at the same time, it is absolutely essential, and that's where we need guidance in terms of doing that properly. So you could say analysis gives way to experience, has to be integrated. He says at times analysis can help, of course, and is necessary in the beginning, but conceptual analysis alone can never completely release the grip of conceptual mind. This is a point Mipham stresses consistently. So then there were steps to the non-conceptual section that's entitled that. And he says, the great perfection offers immediate access to recognizing the nature of reality. Except for the exceptionally gifted few, however, most of us lack the good fortune for instantaneous realization and need to rely on a gradual path of study and contemplation. Mipham describes such a progressive approach to the view of the middle way in 4 stages, which have been said to correspond to the famous 4 lines of the Heart Sutra. Form is emptiness, emptiness is form. There is no form other than emptiness. There is also no emptiness other than form. So the 4 steps, they are empty, unity, freedom from constructs or conceptual constructs, and equality. So we'll look at that. So when we say empty, and this is then, you could say, essentially the path then from analysis into the non-analytical or the non-conceptual. So the first step is where we, through analysis, we see the lack of inherent existence in all phenomena. Nothing withstands analysis. So that's where we initially, like I said earlier, as we have it in the Hinayana, in the Vibhashika view, where they arrive at there being, we speak about then indivisible particles. And that's where there's a cognitive obscuration. That's why the Mahayana, nobody else talks about Hinayana, but within the Mahayana, then there is reason to call this Hinayana because there is still this cognitive obscuration. There's also, of course, sometimes we would say Hinayana is associated with one's aspirations in terms of individual liberation. But essentially, in terms of, you could say, the ontology or the actual assessment of reality, there's a cognitive failure in actually not going far enough with the analysis. And that's where what we are proposing here is going all the way and seeing there's no such a thing as indivisible particles. Even such particles, again, stand in relationship. So there's nothing that ultimately withstands analysis. This is something we do with just the thinking mind. And like I was saying earlier, also within, you could say, the modern day physics, there's similar ideas. Anyway, we can apply this reasoning Well, that's one of, we can apply the reasoning of neither singular or nor multiple. We could say, well, there can never be, there's never anything that's singular. We can keep breaking it down. And there's also nothing that's multiple, because multiple would imply that we had actually find some single unit of which there then are many. So that's where when we apply this, this is famously one of the 4 or 5 Madhyamika reasonings. And this is very much the primary reasoning that's applied within the Svatantrika Yogacarya Madhyamika, Shantarakshita's middle way. So that's why we can apply this kind of analysis. Now things appear when not analyzed. And that's why we say nothing withstands analysis, right? But when we don't analyze, when we're just sort of relating to things ordinarily, well, yeah, they're just there. Things appear when not analyzed. But when analyzed, they seem to be empty. And also remember last time we looked at progressively deeper ways in which you could say first there's not analyzing, then there's I forget the phrase, but you know, a sort of a initial analysis where we understand how we're essentially our perception of reality is hooked up with our the subject that projects, and then there's the deep analysis that understands emptiness. And so that's where we have these increasing degrees of analysis. And that's particular to the Yogacarya, the yogic practice school of the middle way. So anyway, that's where, and this is also something, I remember when Salsakin's the first time said this really, I found this very helpful. And where he just says, anytime that you question anything, you're heading in the direction of ultimate truth. If you don't question anything, yeah, then that's relative truth. The moment you begin to come with these why, where, analyzing things, then we discover complexity. And complexity, just like dependent arising, is almost synonymous, and if not, it is synonymous with emptiness. So that's empty. Then there's unity. That's where, so we say form is emptiness. Emptiness is also form. That's why we say it's not just that everything is empty, but also that emptiness is in no way blocking appearances. So it's not as if all of a sudden there's nothing there. It's just that emptiness and dependent arising are a unity. The moment that we say dependent arising, or interdependent arising, I suspect maybe Douglas is using interdependent, but anyway, same thing, or dependent origination, whatever. But praticca samutpada, this identifying dependency, conditioning means that there's not something that's unchanging, singular, independent. And that's why we say dependent arising, we're saying emptiness in the same word, not two different things. So that's why they're a unity. So in that way, emptiness and appearance are not in conflict. So that's where we're going beyond. We're going beyond this. We understand that the emptiness and appearance is inherent to phenomena themselves. So that's the next is then freedom from constructs, and that's where in that we see how appearance is and emptiness are not different. We can see that is the very nature of phenomena, just like the sky. It's a good example he gives, like the sky and the color blue. They're not two different things. You know, we don't separate the sky and the color blue. So that's where we would say the fact that we attribute solidity, that requires that somebody goes in and say, yo, dude, you know, you're sort of missing out on how things are. Or like the Tonsakin Zermaja says, you know, the Buddha nudges us in the cinema hall and says, you know, it's just a movie. And that's where we understand that it's our projection onto things that are creating this solidity that actually has nothing to do with the objects themselves. And that's where we would say the difference between the appearance and the understanding of the empty nature, that has only to do with the subject. And these differences between appearance and emptiness has nothing to do with the phenomena themselves. These are entirely linguistic or conceptual distinctions. Reality itself doesn't exist out there. With the reality just exists as it is, where there is manifestation, there is appearance, and yet appearances never move from there. By nature, they cannot have any reality if we analyze them. That's where, in and of themselves, phenomena are appearance and emptiness. Equality. So that's where we begin to, when we begin to recognize that it's entirely our confused mind that begins to solidify and which needs to be told appearance and emptiness. When we understand that this nature in itself doesn't actually, you could say, distinguish, that these distinctions are entirely artificial, that's when we settle into and then can familiarize ourselves with this quality of not entangling ourselves in conceptual constructs. This does not mean a vague nothingness, but that's where exactly there is a non-diluted quality in that settling and not being deceived. So we'd say the primary quality of the mind is non-deception, and all our fixation is what entangles us. And that's where we talk about then famously, within the Pith instruction, settle the mind without this fabrication. Within that kind of experience, then we settle into the original condition of the mind, the undiluted condition of the mind, and that's where there's no distinction between Buddhas and sentient beings as far as that aspect of purity goes. That's where we talk about the two purities. One is there's the abiding purity, Rangshineda, and then the Lobo Trulta. That's the elimination of temporary confusion. But as far as settling into the ground nature, then it has no distinction, just like there's no distinction between the two truths. And that's where then we have this authentic insight. And that, again, this is where we've gone beyond ordinary concepts. With the last one here, the freedom from constructs, settling into equality, this is entirely about experience. So the first three, they kind of take us there. The last one is something that has to be experienced. This insight is stabilized through experience. So, and this is something that we very often see in the Madhyamaka teachings, that the four stages, they counteract. They take us to a place in which we no longer fall for these extremes. Existence, non-existence, both existence and non-existence, neither existence nor non-existence. And that's, putting it very simply, is the first is asserting that there's something that's really there. And that's where we counteract that with analysis, but we also see that it's not as if there's some sort of ultimate non-existence. Like we said before, phenomena, they're not blocked in that they're, just because they don't have inherent existence, there's still plenty of appearance. So both the attribution of our reality as existing is flawed, non-existence is also flawed assumption. That's an extreme. And in that these two, they don't exist together. It's not as if things can both exist and not exist. Then the sort of the extreme, or the sort of the idea that maybe there could be both existence and non-existence at the same time, that also is seen to be just a concept. And equally so, to talk about neither existence nor non-existence is again entirely a conceptual project, experience. When we sort of get out of our heads, we can see there is a sort of a web of dependent arising that we find ourselves within. And while it doesn't fall into the extremes of existence or non-existence, it's not as if none of these apply either, or to rather say there's neither of these. That would say that there's neither of anything that we experience. So that's falling into even a sort of more subtle and deeper form of nihilism. So these we generally refer to as the four extremes. And the first two are obvious. The second two, well, they're all in a way conceptual, of course. but they're increasingly subtle. All sentient beings, you could say, operate with the notion of existence, less with the notion of non-existence, even though we say, oh, now that is no longer there. But the two last, they're more of a philosophical nature. These, however, they all constitute extremes in the sense that they are either, you could say, innate forms of misunderstanding reality, or they are acquired forms of misunderstanding reality. So with regards to these four stages, it says, through these four stages, Mipham charts a process through which conceptual analysis is used to transcend concepts. The stages have a certain progression. And he says, we cannot skip any stage without a proper understanding of the stages that precede it. Consequently, a thorough analysis is essential to this process. Even so, while careful analysis is necessary in the preliminary stages, concepts must eventually be overcome in the end. At some point, the conceptual structure needs to break down for a non-conceptual experience to take place. But the problem is, this cannot be done by concepts alone. For Mipham, the process is something like rubbing two sticks together. We need the sticks in the beginning to make the fire. But in the end, the friction from the sticks of concepts results in the non-conceptual fire of wisdom that consumes those sticks. So we use concepts to expose the flaw of concepts. And that's where we leave at the end the certainty, the insight that takes place on the basis of concepts exposes the flaw of concepts themselves, and that's where they then are abandoned, and that's where then non-conceptual experience is then the place in which the actual genuine insight can take place. I'm a little bit tempted to add something in terms of just practice, because we would always say, and this, of course, what we're talking about here is essentially ontology, epistemology. We're talking about, you could say, a very scientific, factual approach in terms of what takes place within experience, or in the experiences of confusion, the projections of confusion, and the dismantling of that. But in terms of practice, we would so often emphasize, and this, of course, is why in the Vajrayana and leading up to the Vajrayana, there's the whole notion of us actually engaging with something that lies beyond concepts, and that really just being, while we can have a theoretical understanding, it's also necessary to have the conditions for, you say, a clear understanding to take place beyond the concepts. And that's where we famously have this line that says, to think that we could understand co-emergent wisdom, which is what we're talking about here, without accumulation of merit, purifying obscurations, and relying on the blessing of an authentic teacher would be utterly foolish. So we often come back to that. Here, of course, we're just talking about, the sort of the tension between analysis and actual, the experiential dimension of wisdom. But for us who are on the path, it's important to understand that this is also where we identify the value of, you could say, establishing the conditions for properly engaging this non-conceptual dimension. Anyway, so we could say that we can understand how the mind is delusional through theory, and then we can turn to the condition that is not deluded through practice. Okay. I'm thinking how I can understand this discussion of wisdom in relation to the body and speech expressions of disciplined study, meditation, and relative bodhicitta. Very good. In that respect, Is it the case that we uncover wisdom by aligning our one individual expression in the world of appearances with the two ontological truth of those appearances as being empty, i.e., in discipline we refrain from activities that express grasping to self and other, such as aggressively motivated shouting, and therefore align with the way things are? Absolutely. That's why when we say the yogic practice school, see, the implication of yoga is that we are aligning ourselves with something that's basic to our nature. And that's where we would say it's not just all rubbish relative truth. It's very much about authentic experience. And so that's where we engage body, speech, and mind through the various practices that you could say have foundation within the vision of the yogic practice school. And um, that's where we engage our body and our speech with practices such as non-aggression. And that's, you could say, you're right, the aspect of discipline. And also we engage this deeper then through the practice of meditation. And that's what we're doing. You're absolutely right with the various aspects of discipline, um, study and meditation, relative bodhicitta. All you could say we could say all the relative practices that we have, they essentially are just designed for one sole purpose, which is realization of the ultimate nature. So that's where they all have a role really in terms of aligning ourselves with this wisdom nature. And also the expressions of that wisdom nature. For example, the expression of the wisdom nature, we could say, is compassion. There's the Dharmakaya and the Rupakaya. There's enlightenment and there's benefiting sentient beings. And you could say the manifest aspect of enlightenment spontaneously is the compassionate manifestation of sentient beings. And so us cultivating bodhicitta, cultivating compassion, kindness, and so forth at the relative level aligns itself also with you could say, the ultimate nature of how things are. I hope that answers the question. Do the first two stages refer to the attachment of the mind and the last two to distinguishing mind? Well, that's interesting. Yes, I mean, they're all about distinguishing confusion from insight. But the first two, yes, they are. We would even say that the first three are more about the attachments of the mind, and the last one then is what takes us beyond the ordinary confused mind. Is a feeling of disillusionment seen as a natural part of integrating these concepts, or is it a sign of misunderstanding? Is relief or ease always the feeling that accompanies correct understanding? That's also a really good question. There's a little bit of danger from analysis. Sorry, I'm just going to clear my throat. So there's a little bit now this of course is not hard and fast, but the problem with the deconstruction and the analysis that we're operating with here is that it could fall into a nihilist extreme, and that is where we would feel disappointment, disillusion. On the other hand, that does take place. And there's a fine place between. I mean, in one way, we could say, hey, I mean, we could even say the entire Buddhism is all about disillusionment, right? Disillusionment, taking us out of illusion. But in sort of our ordinary vernacular, right? Then disillusionment really means disappointment, you know. And so that's where it's important that we don't associate the disillusionment, which you could say is a good thing as we're doing here, with a sense of bleakness or, gosh, I thought there was something there and not there's no longer, you know? You know, like when we found out that Santa Claus didn't exist. So that's where we should make sure that we don't fall in. I was the other day I heard about somebody who had been reading some. This was a Western. This was a Westerner. It was sort of somebody in the 1960s who used to write a lot about Buddhism, and somebody had holed themselves up in somewhere with all his works and were just reading through them, and it emerged as a profoundly dysfunctional person actually, and slightly sort of alienated and so on. So that's where it's important we don't fall into that kind of nihilism. So that's where you could say, is relief, you're right, is relief or ease always the feeling that accompanies correct understanding? Well, ideally. But the thing is, of course, we go through these in terms of, you know, it's not that linear. So of course we inevitably in our journeys from holding on to things as real, placing our hopes in things and persons and situations, where we sober up and find out that, you know, that these are projections, then there is a process in which we kind of maybe understand, but then also there's catching up. And so these feelings that accompany correct understanding, they come in all sorts of leaps and bounds. But at the same time, we should keep in mind that the intention and the very nature of the practice, it is, yes, relief and ease, you know, finding rest in the nature of mind, that sort of thing. Okay, I hope that makes sense. But great questions. Okay. So in terms of, let's just see, what are they again? Oh yeah, the conceptual and the non-conceptual. In terms of these two, one might also see how wedding these two approaches, the conceptual cultivation of a semblance of non-conceptuality and the direct experience of it, is an effective means to bring forth genuine insight. Indeed, this fusion is an important part of Mipham's presentation of the view in meditation, and it is a central means by which he brings together Sutra and Tantra and integrates analytical reason with experiential insight. So that's where the way that this is integrated in the Sutra teachings in terms of essentially the rational understanding in which we arrive at a freedom from constructs and equality. And then in the Tantra, where there's a direct integration of the authentic experience originating from the introduction to co-emergent wisdom, in which then there is the the engagement of all perceptions as from a position of authentic experience, in which there's then this the view of the unity of appearance and emptiness. That is then, you could say, authentic experience that then is integrated through the methodologies of Tantra, and particularly pure perception. So that's where these they both play out, both in the sutra teachings, and or rather they bring together, yes, they bring together the sutra and the tantra teachings. They enable us to understand this, how freedom from the conceptual constructs are basic to then the authentic insight that is the foundation of tantra. We could say that, and this is often a point also, I think we mentioned it before also, that as far as the sutra teaching, well, we would say that in general, we would say that the sutra teachings and the tantra teachings, they, as far as the view goes, they're the same. As far as method goes, the tantra is more profound. But there is also ways in which, and this is what we're exploring here, in the way that we perceive relative perceptions, then the view of Tantra, in that it integrates our perceptions as ultimate truth. It is superior in terms of its view and in terms of its practice. Anyway, see translation 4, really about the, what is it again? The steps to the non-conceptual, I think it's called. It's about those four the 4 steps that we looked at. So 2 meanings of emptiness. So we've been approaching emptiness, right, in various ways, and so we very often have seen how we've had juxtapositions of understanding emptiness. For example, here and today, again, on this analytical understanding, that's what the guy is trying to write, analytical understanding versus non-conceptual experience, right? This has been a big thing today. We've also, in the last time, we talked about categorized and uncategorized ultimate. And again, that's where there's conceptual understanding of emptiness versus, again, direct experience, realization. And then also we have, the emptiness is approached as the 2 truths that we operate with, you know, in post-meditation. When we're thinking about things, we say, you know, there's delusion, non-delusion, and there's the ways in which this is understood in terms of appearance and emptiness. And then there's the experience without that kind of 2 truth division in meditation itself. So that's where the emptiness is approached, again, in 2 ways. And then we have emptiness as a conceptual negation and non-conceptual unity. And again, this is where we, again, distinguish between pure analysis and simply settling, like in meditation. So, so he says, the meaning of non-conceptual emptiness cannot be directly stated, but it can be shown. It can be approached in analysis based on a conceptual semblance of its meaning, as we saw earlier in the stages of middle way analysis. Similarly, non-conceptual wisdom can be approached in meditation by the mind assuming a semblance of wisdom in unstructured meditation, in just letting be. Unlike the emptiness that is a mere absence, relating to the non-conceptual meaning of emptiness calls for a uniquely experiential participatory approach. And that again is where we see ways in which this is, in some traditions, very much about the analysis, in other traditions, more about settling into meditation. So that's where we come across these notions in which we say there's the non-implicative negation and an implicative negation, sometimes called non-affirmative, sometimes called affirmative negations. There's Mengak and Maingak. And so the first, a non-implicative negation, leave us with nothing. And that's where traditionally, what is he has here? He has, I forget, it's not the cheesecake one, but there's something else he says. But anyway, traditionally, very often we would say, obviously coming from the Indian source, we would say the Brahmin doesn't drink. Okay, period. The Brahmin doesn't drink. You might get slightly worried, but you know, that doesn't give you any information about how he might actually survive. But it's just, there's no implication. It's just the Brahmin doesn't drink. Now, an implicative negation allows for something. That's in when we say the Brahmin doesn't drink alcohol. Ah, okay. So applied to emptiness, the first leaves us with nothing other than the idea of lack of inherent existence. And that can be helpful because that's an antidote to our, you could say, to our belief that things exist as solid. So just saying there is no, you know, there's just nothing there. That's okay. But, and it can to some extent serve, but it is really still an idea. That leaves the latter, and that refers to the implicative negation, that leaves something. And that is then what we would say suchness. And this, of course, is what is some traditions that they would emphasize. Yes, we need to be clear. We're taking out delusion, but we're not taking away non-delusion. Non-delusion, nothing wrong with that. The nature of mind, nothing wrong with that. If we just say there's nothing there, then what? So that's where it goes a bit further. And that's something that needs to be experienced. Now, these views, they are very much associated with the Gelug understanding of emptiness. It's also the Gelug understanding of Buddha nature, in that it's non-implicative. For them, Buddha nature means that there's nothing there. That's the core of wisdom. There's simply just a lack of inherent existence, and that way, before then also Douglas Duckworth was saying, for them, for the approach there, there is simply the notion of sustaining that analytical muscle, or that analytical presence, which is then seen as being valid meditation. And then there's Jonang, the implicative. That's more about then settling into suchness, being content to settle in the undiluted nature of mind. And that's where the implication would be, yeah, you say you're settling into the nature of mind, but is it really that? And that's where some would say, nah, you might need to have some analytical, something analytical taking place. Otherwise, you might just end up a bit dull. So that's where these two, in a way, they constitute this dialectic that we're talking about here, right? So the former hold emptiness as a quality of phenomena, that's a non-implicative, the Gilug approach, and the latter as the ground of phenomena. So the Gilug would hold that emptiness is simply the nature of phenomena, and the latter then, the Jonang tradition, is then the ground, we would say that there's emptiness is understood as the ground of phenomena, that there is an actual real emptiness that gives rise to phenomena. But that's again where Mipham actually, you say with these two, the Gilug and the Jonang, there's been some historical sort of like, loggerheads. Then Mipham actually, that's a great negotiator. How do you say, a mediator? You have two parties, and you go in and you disagree with both of them, and there's a good chance that they might then both turn to you. In a way, then you've established peace. Anyway, that's not necessarily what's being said here. That's entirely just my own sort of silly take on it. But the thing is, Mipham actually doesn't agree with, or he has something to say about these, and both of these approaches he can potentially be flawed. And he would like to make a point that emptiness is simply the nature of reality as it permeates all of reality, a unity of appearance and emptiness. And so in that sense, the emptiness is not something that's different from any phenomena. It's not something that just exists in terms of a non-implicative, nor is it particularly an implicative that there's something that's sort of there giving rise to something. For him, it permeates all of reality. So Douglas Duckworth says the relationship between emptiness known experientially versus analytically, and how emptiness should best be represented, are important factors of in this debate. These factors play into the debates between the yogic practice school and the consequent school, and between the proponents of other emptiness and self-emptiness in Tibet. So that's where we have on all the way down through the Buddhist teaching, you could say there are the places in which we emphasize the ontological and the places where we emphasize the epistemic. There are places where we're looking at the nature of reality objectively. There's places where we take into account the subjective ways in which we know phenomena. And that's where this also is reflected in the schools that we have here. The yogic practice school, more about the experience; consequent school, more about the nature of reality in the ultimate sense. So this also plays out when we talk about the middle way schools that are known as Shentong and Rangtong. And this is then what we mean with other emptiness and self-emptiness. So some then, other emptiness, Jonang tradition, but not just limited to Jonang tradition, also within the Gelug tradition, there are some that endorse other emptiness, and also within the Sakya tradition, there are those who endorse other emptiness, such as Shakya Chogden. And then you have, and in the Kagyu school, you have Jamgön Kongtrul. So these are all, they're all what we call Shentong, or other emptiness. And then you have self-emptiness, which is then the Gelug, they would say they are self-empty. and most of the Sakyapas would say they belong to that, and also Jamgön Mipham, and also many Kaji masters. But Mipham is going to now go on to say, well, some of the implications of what we have in the Gelug position actually seems to imply that they belong to other emptiness, and this, of course, also is something that you could say accounts for some interesting exchanges. So we'll look a bit more at So Jamgön Mipham's view on the middle way departs from the Gelug and Jonang view. So this is more about the unity. The Gelug middle way holds appearance as being relative truth and emptiness as being ultimate truth. So that's where we would say then, and that's fair enough. You know, this where we can say, well, they're dependent arisings. That's what we perceive. That's relative truth, and what's behind it is ultimate truth. But there, then we would simply say here, conventional reality, the chairs and table remain relative. Again, fair enough. That's where if we have this condition of not analyzing, then that's relative truth. For the Gelug, negating the reality of conventional truth entails the extreme of nihilism. If we then go in and analyze and say, well, appearances, they also are, and you know, all the tables and chairs, they are sort of just empty appearances. That would then entail to negate the reality of that conventional truth. That's where they say, oh yeah, no, anything that appears, that necessarily is that has a reality. The problem is that we're attributing solidity to it, but the things themselves, oh yeah, conventionally, they're real. So for them to negate the reality of conventional truth, it entails the extreme of nihilism. We'll see more on that. But to view emptiness, they would say, as other than lack of inherent existence entails the extreme of eternalism. And that's why they would say emptiness, the ultimate nature, ultimate truth. That's simply just that nothing has, in the ultimate sense, in any inherent existence. And to say other than that, which obviously the Jonangs, they would say, there's wisdom, there's the Jonangs, I would say this thing that they call Tony in Namkun Chogdan, means emptiness endowed with all the supreme aspects, means within emptiness, all the qualities of Buddha nature are there. Why would you want to attain enlightenment if there wasn't all these qualities associated with emptiness, right? So that's where the Gelug, they would say, to sort of attribute reality to that falls into extreme of nihilism. Sorry, eternalism. That's no different from the Hindu positions of Atman and so forth. So some pretty sort of, you get a strong positions on that. Now for the Jonang, affirming conventional reality of relative truth entails eternalism. For them, they would say all sort of samsaric phenomena, to begin to say that they have some sort of conventional reality within relative truth. Well, that's eternalism. Then you're giving, you know, things some absolute value. So that for them would be eternalism. To say that ultimate truth as a mere lack of inherent existence, that's a rather sad view on, they would say, on ultimate truth. They would say that sounds very nihilistic. Is that all? Okay, we arrived at enlightenment and there's nothing but lack of inherent truth. So the ultimate truth. So that inherent existence. So that's where for the Jonang that entails in nihilism. For the Jonang, negating the truth of relative appearances, which they then do, that avoids the extreme of eternalism. They would say, you know, relative appearances, they have no ultimate real reality, and that, hence doing that, we have a middle way here between the avoiding the extreme of eternalism, affirming the reality of absolute truth. That would avoid the extreme of nihilism. They would say absolute truth and has reality. Yeah, that's avoiding the extreme of nihilism. So you can say there's some interesting views here, and Mipham, he identifies a very interesting point. He would say the middle way to truth are approached from the perspectives of Gelug, the experience of a sentient being, Jonang, the experience of the Buddha. But then you can say the Gelug are very compassionate because they actually start with the experience of a sentient being, which is fair enough. The Jonang, they're more, say, taking, you could say, the high road, again, more ontological view, perhaps, in terms of just saying, well, you know, that's the nature of relative truth. You know, if you begin to hold that as real, what's the point, etc. So they both have value. But Mipham Rinpoche, he's then suggesting, again, he's suggesting an approach of unity where he says in non-duality, and then again, within that experience, where we go into an actual, you could say, proper experience that is authentic, then there are the divisions of sentient beings or Buddhas is simply not something that is what we call ultimately established. And that's where we would say appearance and emptiness are indivisible, as per both two truth models. So we would say appearance and emptiness when we talk about the two truth model that we call that of appearance and emptiness, or the ontological two truth model. They are indivisible there. And also in the experience, authentic experience, then also appearance and emptiness, they are the unity of the two. They are you could say basic to authentic experience. And even when they're not experienced or known as such, even in delusion when they're not perceived as such, then nevertheless the nature as such doesn't move, it doesn't change. So in this way, appearance, what he's proposing here is that this understanding of appearance and emptiness, this constitutes the vision of the experience of non-duality, and as such, for him, this becomes a middle way approach that doesn't fall into doesn't entail the problems that are associated with, as he sees it, the Gelug and the Jonang tradition. So, Douglas Duckworth says, in Mipham's presentation of the middle way as unity, to claim that anything stands up to ultimate analysis is to fall to the extreme of eternalism. Wisdom, or even a divine mandala, cannot be found when its true nature is sought by analysis. Thus he holds that there is no true essence in anything. According to Mipham, the position that nothing ultimately exists is the claim of self-emptiness, a claim to which he aligns himself. With this claim, he avoids the extreme of eternalism. On the other hand, to deny the reality of what does not exist conventionally, like saying that tables and chairs do not exist in ordinary perspectives, or that wisdom and divine mandalas do not exist in the perspective of sublime beings, is to fall to the extreme of nihilism. By asserting that these exist conventionally, he avoids the extreme. So that's where, on one hand, he's making sure that he's not in any way asserting anything in absolute truth, but he's also making a point that whatever appears, either to ordinary sentient beings or to sublime beings, as they perceive, they exist as and function, then asserting that he doesn't fall into the extreme of nihilism. This sounds pretty plausible, right? So here, then there's an overview that we have. This is it's pretty good actually. And you know, you don't have, I don't know, possibly you might have these kind of overviews, but I've only seen it really from Douglas Duckworth. So I can only congratulate him really on a lot of, you could say, overview that is very helpful when approaching these matters. I would say if we have this down, what's being presented in this work here, it really helps us then when we engage with, you could say, more more educated and the more traditional ways that this material is presented. The problem is the traditional way, and we say traditional, but it's just that really constitutes a very sophisticated approach. So for the modern person, you know, from the person who's not grounded, you could say, it's a bit like going from, you know, from kindergarten into high school. And that's where we need to have something that takes us there. And that's where this process for a modern person not familiar with the with the arguments, you know, the perspectives, the whole idea of negation and affirmation, etc., all of that is not really basic to the modern Buddhist that, you know, that comes to this material. And that's where something like this is very helpful in terms of gaining an overview. Then that sort of opens doors. Anyway, this kind of presentation here, I think is quite helpful. The last one I really didn't go into, but maybe we can do it with this one here. Time permits. I think this will be the last. Let me just see here. Yeah, we're going to go into the pot. Pot is not empty of pot. It is empty of inherent existence. That I think all of us can benefit from reading the last two sections once again. Anyway, so the various Buddhist traditions, the Jonang, the Gelug, and the Nyingma, according to Mipham, then they have what emptiness negates. So for the Jonang, emptiness negates unreal phenomena. That's where emptiness is what takes away the obscuration. And then it says, what is empty? What is empty of what? And that's where we then will say, when this takes away, this emptiness is understood. What emptiness negates, it enables us to see that true reality is empty of unreal phenomena. That's where, okay, now we see what's real. So the type of negation used to indicate emptiness is an implicative negation. We'd say phenomena are empty, but they're not empty of Buddha nature. And so the referent of empty, is that there's an underlying ground, a substrate that is the non-delusion of the qualities of enlightenment and so forth. So that's the Jonang. The Gelug, they would say what emptiness negates is inherent existence in anything. What is empty of what is, they would say phenomena. What we then do, and we look at then phenomena, we would say they're empty of inherent existence. So that's why we look at the tables and chairs and we say, okay, there's tables and chairs, they're empty of inherent existence, but that's it. The table and chairs are still there, but they function. The only thing is they're empty of inherent existence. Fair enough. And that's very helpful. What's implied there is the type of negation is non-implicative negation. The Mengag, that's simply saying there's not anything there. And so the referent of that is then the quality, the perception of solidity is what is negated. So that's where we're left then with for them, then it's on the basis of understanding of any given phenomena, any quality that then is seen for possessing this innate inherent existence. That's then where we establish emptiness on the basis of seeing that these phenomena, they lack inherent existence. So that's the referent. Now for Mipham, he makes a point really with regards to emptiness, because there's one that is understood, like we went through, you could say the gradual understanding, and then there's the actual experience. So the categorized is then conceptual, the uncategorized is non-conceptual. So that's where in categorized, yes, we would negate inherent existence. We totally agree. So that's where that approach is very helpful, at least to begin with. But ultimately, and that's where there's some disagreement. They would say ultimately, then what is negated is not just inherent existence, but the whole, the whole condition of delusion, which are the dualistic or conceptual constructs. Now, what is empty of what? That's where in the categorized emptiness, categorized ultimate, then what is, just like in the Gelug, phenomena are empty of inherent existence. But in the uncategorized, that's where again we would discover that's where the in the uncategorized, then we would understand how that reality is empty of these conceptual constructs. It's simply referred to as just inconceivability or inconceivable. So that's where it takes us. So the first one, the categorized, is simply just understanding emptiness of inherent existence. The second one goes beyond any conceptual construction. Now, the type of negation that's used here for Mipham, and that is what essentially signifies him being what he would say a true proponent of the self-emptiness middle way, is a non-implicative negation. So again, when the referent is the quality, the perceived objects, and in the case of the uncategorized, is simply that there's no particular reference whatsoever, or there's an understanding of the unity of appearance and emptiness. So, okay, like I said, the next sections we'll save that for next time, and there's some you're really getting the, you could say, the being exposed to some of the subtle discussions around these topics. But at the same time, this really gives us a lot of pondus, or a lot of weight, in terms of approaching this whole discussion. So it's definitely there. The discussion is here for a purpose. And remember also, Mipham, very much a practitioner of the great perfection, just wants us to arrive at a place where we can meditate without confusion, where there's clarity, exactly knowing what we're doing. We can approach meditation with certitude. So that's, anyway, that's this last two sections. We'll go over that next time. So please read these two last sections here in chapter 7 and also chapter 8, then immanent wisdom. Thank you. No questions? Okay, all right. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Okay. Okay. See you next. Oh, hold on. Thought there was something I'd forgotten. By this accumulation of merit, may I obtain all-seeing omniscience, and may all faults be defeated. The whirling turbulent waves of birth, aging, sickness, and death, from the ocean of samsara, may I liberate beings. May bodhicitta, precious and sublime, arise where it has not yet come to be, and where it has arisen may it never fail, but grow and flourish ever more and more. Through all my lives may I remain at your lotus feet and study, reflect, and meditate on your texts again and again. Grant your blessings that I will hold, protect, and spread your teachings to the limits of space for as long as samsara lasts. Thank you.